The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is John Ruskay. As Director of Education at the 92nd Street Y, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y and this concluding evening of Film Critics on Criticism. Regarding the format this evening, following the moderated conversation on stage, you will be able to submit written questions on the index cards which you received as you entered the hall. Please write your questions clearly on the cards and pass them to the center aisles. In about an hour, ushers will collect the cards and bring them back stage for presentation. You didn't get any. You can use anything else. They will be accepted backstage. This being the concluding evening of our series, I want to take but a moment to publicly acknowledge the splendid contribution which Dr. Annette Insdorf has made both to this series and to the others in which she has participated this year at the Y. As you know, Dr. Insdorf is Associate Professor of Film at Columbia and Yale Universities, where she has been teaching film history and criticism since 1975. A frequent contributor to the Sunday New York Times Arts and Leisure section, and the author of numerous articles on film in publications which include Film Comment and American Film. Dr. Insdorf is also the author of Francois Truffaut, a critical study of the director's films published by William Morrow in 1979, and most recently, Indelible Shadows, Film and the Holocaust, published by Random House. Dr. Insdorf brings a very special combination of intelligence and charm to our podium, and for this we are profoundly grateful. Our guest for this concluding evening of Critics on Criticism is Pauline Kael, an undergraduate philosophy major at the University of California at Berkeley. Ms. Kael has written for numerous publications, including Partisan Review, Vogue, The New Republic, McCall's, The Atlantic, and Harper's. Since 1968, Ms. Kael has served with distinction as the movie critic at The New Yorker. Her books include Deeper into Movies, Reeling, When the Lights Go Down, and the 1982 5001 Nights at the Movies. Her newest book, Taking It All In, will be available in bookstores next month. Ms. Kael has received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1964, a George Polk Memorial Award for Criticism in 1970, a National Book Award in 1974 for Deeper into Movies, and the 1978 Women in Film Award. She has also been honored by numerous institutions and received honorary doctorates from Georgetown University, Smith College, Reed College, Haverford, and the School of Visual Arts in New York. Pauline Kael is regarded by many as the most intelligent and probing film critic in this country. We are therefore particularly honored that she is with us for this concluding evening of our series. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Annette Insdorf, and our special guest, the film critic of The New Yorker, Ms. Pauline Kael.
Good evening to all of you. Welcome. I'd like to start off by asking Pauline Kael the typical question about how many movies do you see per year, about how many of them do you review?
I see about 4 or 5 a week most of the time. There are occasions during festivals or special events when I see a great many more, but I allow myself the luxury now of reviewing only the ones I'm really interested in, and that sometimes, I'm afraid, offends readers. But if I had spent time writing about every film of Fassbinder's, I think I would have given up reviewing altogether. There has to be a certain amount of joy in writing about a movie. And so I allow myself the freedom now to disregard certain films or to explain very briefly why I'm not writing about them. So it isn't as onerous a burden as it may seem to see that many films.
And how did you start out as a film critic?
Well, I started out a very stupid way, I'm afraid, because there was no way to make a living at it. I started out writing for magazines such as Leroy Jones's Culture. He was Leroy Jones then. Partisan Review, Sight and Sound in England. I got more and more interested in writing about film, but I was doing it, I'm afraid, the way one might write a poem and send it to a quarterly. And I published quite a few pieces, Massachusetts Review, any quarterly you can think of. I think because at that point, which was in the 50s, there were very few magazines that paid or that could provide a job for a film critic that wanted the kind of intense analysis I was interested in. And so it took a long time before I started making a living as a movie critic. I did other things for a living for many years. I was actually in my late 40s before I was offered a regular job as a movie critic.
And were there any particular influences, other critics that you had read before, or was it just a passion for films that led you to write about them?
Well, I was fairly passionate about all the arts, I think, when, particularly in my 20s and 30s, and I was interested in critics in other forms. I know it seems odd to people, but I was particularly interested in R.P. Blackmer, and very few people have ever detected his influence on my writing. Only one person ever has. I did like James Agee enormously, and there were people who were fun on certain kinds of films, such as Manny Farber and others, but I don't think they were more of an influence than people writing about other arts.
Mm-hmm. Now, the titles of your books have a real erotic component to them, like
that
I Lost It.
It's perfectly deliberate.
I Lost It at the Movies, Kiss, Kiss, Bang, Bang, Going Steady, Reeling. And one of your most famous pieces, of course, was about Last Tango in Paris as an erotically liberating masterpiece. And could you elaborate a little on the degree to which a film should or could be a sensual or erotic experience for the viewer and critic?
Well, I think it is in general. I think the films that affect us the most often have a strong erotic influence on us. And I tried to emphasize that in the titles of my books. I've been sort of amused at the reviewers who from time to time seem to think they are unconscious, that I am simply bursting out at the seams and don't know what I'm saying in the titles. I always felt that it was one of the elements that movie critics pretended to ignore and ignored publicly, that they didn't want to deal with how the film affected them or about the kind of kinesthetic response they might have to a given performer or to a given film. And they often talked about the theme or the plot or the elements which were really much less important to the viewers than the passion that they saw on the screen. I mean, it's almost impossible, say, to see the early 30s films of Joan Crawford and Clark Gable without responding to what's going on the screen. And when you see a film with a young Jean Harlow, that's a very important element. It was certainly a very important element with Garbo. And it has become a very important element again in recent times with, say, films such as Scorsese's Mean Streets or Taxi Driver, where you do feel an erotic pull to the film and feel how the characters on the screen are reacting erotically themselves. And I think it's one of the reasons that respectable people have always attacked movies. It's one of the reasons that they have preferred the stage and regarded theater as more cultured. And it's because of that erotic element, it's because of a kind of sensual intoxication that you often feel at the movies. And I think a great many people who are educated like the control they feel at a stage performance and are very uneasy about the lack of control they sometimes feel at a movie, particularly when they come out and say, wow. And I wanted to analyze what went into that wow. So I was trying, I think, to get at how we really respond to movies rather than simply to review them conventionally.
Now, if you had to define your role as a critic, do you consider yourself more as a kind of explicator of a film, an arbiter of taste? And also, you've attacked a lot of prestige films like Gandhi or Sophie's Choice. Do you have different critical standards for a film that has pretensions as opposed to a tiny film that has no claims?
Well, let's go back a step. I've never regarded myself as an arbiter of taste. That I think belongs to a different period when critics really thought of themselves that way. I'm interested in what the film means to me and what I think it means as a movie and how it really affects people. And I've tried to be as honest as I can about how I responded to that movie. One of the things that I miss in a great many movie reviews is an honest response. I feel often the reviewers are pleasing their editors and pleasing their readers and not being honest about the film. I remember once I was on a television program in which I was roundly denounced by the host for having praised Last Tango in Paris. And in the commercial break, he said to me, "You know, I really loved that movie, but this is what people expect of me." Well, I think very often movie critics and critics in other forms give the public what they think the public expects of a critic. They want to be respected in their community for their good taste. And so, well, look at a show such as the Ebert-Siskel program. The dogs are almost never big studio productions. The dogs are always little porny films or little independent films that it's safe to make fun of. There's no real push behind those films. They don't have an advertising budget to make themselves look respectable. And I've noticed, particularly among television critics, that respectability seems to be the major element in why they praise certain films. You asked about films such as Gandhi, and do I have a different set of criteria? No. I think Richard Attenborough has always been a mediocre director, and I think it showed more conspicuously when he had a major subject, that he simply wasn't up to it. And you know, we have had great films on modern India, particularly the films made by Louis Malle. I mean, films made by an outsider. Obviously, we have the films of Satyajit Ray. But Louis Malle has made a series of 8 documentaries in modern India that are superb, that really give you a feeling for the country and what's going on there. And nothing in Gandhi even resembles that country that we saw in those films. Gandhi is such a cleaned up, you know, when you see the untouchables demonstrating, they're beautifully dressed and they're in perfect file and ranks. You can almost see the English soldiers training them for the movie. It seemed to me a very limited and narrow view politically, and a very poor piece of movie making. In the case of Chariots of Fire, I thought people were simply carried away by the idea of you know, winning your race. It was very much a Reagan-era movie. But it was one of the most... It was a very sloppily made movie in most ways. I mean, most people, I think, were waiting for those two men to compete against each other, and we're never quite sure why they didn't. And the cutting was so odd that the man who was narrating it got lost during most of the movie, so we had no idea how he could be narrating what he wasn't present at. It really seemed to me a rather scrappy movie put together in the editing room with nothing but this rah-rah, upbeat sentiment to keep it going. And I think when American films make people nervous, or when they're particularly bum, as they are right now, people fall for mediocre work from England. It has a certain kind of cachet, and you know, the people have those beautiful accents. But we've had some very good American movies that nobody has gone to. And it has become rather a disgrace that the best movies not only don't get supported by the press, but nobody goes to, and they disappear very quickly. And there's just an inordinate amount of talk about French films, say. I mean, if I read one more article in the New York Times about Federico Fellini or Woody Allen or Francois Truffaut or Diane Corrie, I mean, there have to be limits. I mean, Francois Truffaut has not made a good movie in many years. I think the last movie of his that I liked was The Story of Adele H. He has been turning out movies that are really not much more than on the level of TV sitcoms in the last few years. The Woman Next Door. Some of these movies are really pitiful from a great movie maker. They get praised just as if they were great works. And it's as if certain people were surrounded by such respectability that everything they do is going to get praised. And all it does is take away from the greatness of their great work. I mean, Godard has not made a movie that wasn't full of misery and sourness and unpleasantness and funk for many years, but those movies get praised now in a way his really great movies didn't. That way the press manages to be wrong all the time. I'm sorry.
No,
you asked.
I did. I stand by it. That does, of course, lead into this interesting question of auteurism, which you've been, of course, associated with many years ago. When Andrew Sarris was first championing the director as the auteur and using the American Hollywood system to do so, you once rather zestily said that auteurism is directors shoving bits of style up the crevices of the plot. And one of my more fond lines. And then, of course, you have yourself supported certain directors in terms of the development of their career, at least in America, like Robert Altman, Scorsese, Coppola, Mazursky. I guess
only certain films of theirs. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't support a director. I write about a film. When I think a film is really exciting or innovative, I try to explain why and what it's about and what it's doing that's new. Robert Altman made Brewster McCloud right after MASH. I did not like Brewster McCloud. He made Images, which I didn't like. On the other hand, Robert Altman has made not only MASH, but McCabe and Mrs. Miller, The Long Goodbye, Thieves Like Us, Nashville, probably as many first-rate movies as any director of his generation. And I've tried to give those films their due. I think his last wonderful movie was Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, which hardly anybody went to see, and which I thought got a very undeserved bad press. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to praise Quintet, or movies that I have a hard time sitting through.
Mm-hmm. And are there any directors these days that you feel are consistently making fine films that we should be watching with more care for example?
There are directors who are doing quite marvelous work who I don't think have had their due. I think Phil Kaufman is a first-rate director, and that the failure of an audience to show up for the right stuff is rather bewildering, unless it's the effect of television viewing and people associate that kind of movie with television and think they've seen enough about the astronauts and just don't give a really first-rate film a chance. He also made Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which I thought was a stunning piece of work, and that was not very well attended. Yes, there are others. This year, I'd say the most conspicuous case was Roger Spottiswoode, a young director from England who is, however, an American resident and has been here for some time, who made the film Under Fire. which I really think was a marvelous piece of work. And it's very depressing when you see movies like that die. I know how depressing it must be to the people who worked in them. Joanna Cassidy, I thought, gave perhaps the finest performance in an American movie by a woman this year. And she didn't get anything of the recognition she deserves. And I assume that means she's condemned to be Buffalo Bill's girlfriend unto eternity. She's really a better actress than she gets a chance to show on television. Yeah, there are terrible flaws in the system, in the way movies are released and in the way the public perceives them. I think that certain movies get simply an inordinate amount of publicity and attention, and others just dribble off, and generally the ones that dribble off are the ones that have something new or exciting about them. This has been a terrible period for American movies the last few years. I mean, a year in which people are talking seriously about terms of endearment has to be a mediocre time. And that doesn't mean that France is the answer. We've had a few good movies from Italy. Certainly, The Night of the Shooting Stars is a major film, and Three Brothers was a marvelous film. There was an interesting film from Italy that very few people went to see called Tales of Ordinary Madness. It had a little bit of outre sexual content, and I think people were put off by that. It was based on a book by Charles Bukowski. And I think people didn't give it a fair shot. They treated it as if it were simply a porny film, which it isn't. But this has not been a great year for movies. It's very strange. There's this overwhelming interest in movies, and yet most of us go to see one disappointing movie after another. And I very often get discouraged because it's no fun writing about one bum movie after another. And it's particularly no fun if other people have called that movie a masterpiece. And so you're going to get all that hostile mail from people who assume that it's got to be a masterpiece, or why would so many people say so?
Well, yeah, I can understand what you're talking about. I would like to know perhaps more about why. I mean, a few years ago, you took a break from reviewing and you went to Hollywood and worked there for a little while. And when you came back, you wrote what, in my opinion, is perhaps the most incisive and scathing piece ever written about the Hollywood system. In fact, last week, Rex Reed quoted from it. He said, LA is the only place where you can die of encouragement. And maybe you could elaborate perhaps on how your firsthand experience or observation in Hollywood either affected your reviewing or gave you an inkling of why these films that keep coming out are so mediocre.
I don't think I learned a lot that I didn't know before. The one major thing that I discovered was how many wonderful scripts there were that nobody's going to make. And I had, in common with a lot of other critics, assumed that there simply weren't the great scripts because so many of the movies we see are so excruciatingly badly written. And I saw wonderful script after wonderful script. In most cases, they had already been buried and rewritten. As the company got interested in whichever star had just had a hit, the script was rewritten for that star's specifications. So there would be 5 or 6 scripts written on top of one that had been wonderful to start with, and each one got worse and worse because, of course, the people hired to write them had no particular interest in the subject and often had never even gone back to the original book or to the original script, had simply tried to tailor it to the specifications that the producers had given them. And I think the loss is just enormous. The expense is huge. It adds to the budget of the film. And it's so widespread that it's simply part of the system. Writers come cheap, and their work is destroyed. That I saw much more vividly than I could have guessed from across the country. And I also saw how much the personalities of the people at the studios affected their decisions. Even though they all were obeying pretty much the same economic principles, which were dictated by a sale to television and to various other subsidiary media. Their own personalities had a lot to do with their decisions. In that, I think it's very much like seeing who runs a given country at a given time. And even though we know that a different president may not make that much difference in American policy, it's amazing how many small decisions are made day by day that disrupt a social structure or improve it. And I think the same thing is true at the studios. The people at the top are absolute monarchs for a very brief period. And they are looking for short-run success because, of course, the conglomerates that control the studios want a success right now. And so there is no planning for the future. There is nothing about developing stars or developing directors or thinking about 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead. It is always this year and this month and this week and what can we do now? And the ultimate effect of that is disastrous because it means that everybody at the moment is riding the same tailwind. They're all trying to produce another flash dance, which was a fluke. But now every film you see practically is lifted from something else plus flash dance. and of course the enormous box office success of Staying Alive has not been overlooked. I mean, it's amazing how bad a movie can be a great hit. It's overwhelming that people will go to see Staying Alive. They're now going to see Footloose, which is really pre-Andy Hardy. It's, it's about a small town that has passed a law against dancing. And the high school kids have to do something about it in order to have a senior prom. Well, I mean, this is not exactly what we would have expected at the end of the 60s or during the 70s, when movies seemed to be growing up. I mean, these are not the inheritors of Last Tango or Bonnie and Clyde or any of the great films of the past. They are simply spin-offs of MTV, and they're spin-offs of cynicism. There is nobody really believes in a movie like Footloose who's working on it, except maybe some of the poor kids who think their careers are going to go someplace from it, and maybe they will. But these are musicals without any dance. I mean, they're dance musicals without any dance. The dance is created in the editing room. And they represent a low point for American movies, and yet they are going to be imitated for the next few years.
That's a problem. You've also called attention to the problem of violence, for example, criticizing films like Dirty Harry and Magnum Force, not so much because they're violent, but because they're emotionless and are able to manipulate the sort of latent thug sensibilities of the average moviegoer. Do you see this as a major problem these days, or are the other problems overriding it?
Oh, I think the other problems are much bigger. I mean, we need good movies before we can worry about the bad ones. The strange thing about the whole issue of violence is that people so often, I think, attack the wrong movies. They attack the movies with the violence that frightens them. They attack a movie such as Dressed to Kill, where you're horrified when someone is attacked. And they are not at all upset by the Eastwood films such as Magnum Force, in which you're waiting for the next killing and cheering the killer, Dirty Harry himself, in which the hero is always the killer. And in one movie after another, Clint Eastwood, mows people down. And it's totally affectless. And the whole point is how garish the killings can be and how much he can sneer at the people as he kills them. And that, I think, is something maybe to consider. And it ties in with the kind of violence you get on television, which is often the only excitement on the screen. But generally speaking, The artists who get attacked are the ones who make you feel something. And it's a very strange thing, just as, way back when, it was D.H. Lawrence who got attacked as a pornographer, not the people who were writing the under-the-counter, simple, porny novels. And I think it's always the person who makes you feel something that people get upset about.
To change the tack a little bit, the past three critics that have been here, I asked each of them, who do you read? Which other film critics do you read? And every single one said you. So I now feel obligated to ask, do you read other film critics? Who do you enjoy most?
I read some of them, and I read also a great many critics in other fields. Who are the critics I enjoy most? I enjoy Jim Wolcott, who writes on film for Texas Monthly. I enjoy Lloyd Rose, who is a new young woman critic who has been writing in Atlantic, writing on both theater and film. She has a wonderful article out in the March Atlantic on John Guare's plays and has done interesting pieces on Spielberg and De Palma. I like Veronica Gang when she's writing about movies, because even when we disagree, her style is very pert and fresh and invigorating. She's a wonderful writer. I like, among the ones who are strictly movie critics, I sometimes like Dave Kerr, who writes for the Chicago Reader and also Chicago Magazine. He's, I think, one of the most intelligent auteurs I've ever read. He makes a marvelous case for what I often think are very bad movies, like Victor Victoria. I like David Edelstein, who has now left the Boston Phoenix and who is starting in at the Village Voice. There are quite a few interesting people. I'm sure I've left out a lot of other good ones. David Anson, I think, is sometimes very sensitive in Newsweek, and I like his work. That isn't to say that I don't read the Times. I take a squeeze of it to see which way things are going, but I don't read it with any great pleasure. And let me see. No, I think that just about covers it. That gives you the idea, okay?
It's a good idea.
I don't read the Daily News. Or is it the Post? I'm sorry. Wherever it is that Reed holds forth. Okay.
In fact, actually, a couple of years ago when David Anson started writing for Newsweek and David Denby for New York Magazine, people discerned an influence of Pauline Kael in their work. And that leads to another question. A lot of people have indeed, including myself, acknowledged that reading your work has in fact sharpened our sensibilities or influenced the way we look at films. Do you sense your own influence in some of these younger writers?
Yes, and I hate it. I just hate it. Because it's one thing to feel that you've had an influence on making people go at movies in a more personal way, but when you see your frame of reference, your syntax, your old phrases, it kills you. I mean, it's not flattering, it's horrifying. And I mean, that is pretty awful. And I think some people have incorporated me. They've absorbed me so much that I can't use the phrases that come most naturally to me, or I sound like them. It's very painful. There are critics that I think I've had a good influence on. I think David Anson would be an example of that. I think he possibly takes movies somewhat more seriously because of me. I don't think he writes like me. There are a number of younger critics across the country who I think do write like me, and I try not to read them.
That leads also to the question of there's a growing, as I think you know, number of film study courses. I mean, there are courses, programs in universities where people are not only studying filmmaking, but also how to become film writers, either screenwriters or film critics. Do you think that there are some negative aspects of that, whether it's in filmmaking, for example, the filmmakers who so absorb the history of films that they can no longer do anything but spew back the cliches in a new form, or with film criticism, or is it basically something that you're happy about?
I don't know where it will go. But it seems to me to be a good critic in any form. Probably some experience of all the arts would help, and particularly in movies that do take in so many of the other arts. I do find that a lot of people specialize in movies too young, and I don't think they're going to get any better. Some of them are absolutely amazing. They're just incredibly facile. I mean, you read them on their school papers, and they already have a whole point of view and a whole approach and a whole kind of swagger in their writing, and they sound terrific. And I have a feeling they're not ever going to get any better because it's too soon. I mean, you know, if you start majoring in film and writing reviews to be graded on when you're 19 or 20 or 21, how are you ever going to learn anything about anything else in the world? I think it's a rotten thing to major in. I think if dealing with crap about 90% of the time, and it's very likely to make you very cynical, and your writing is going to deteriorate rather than to get better, because once you've got a job, you think anything you say is good enough. I'm inclined to go along with, I mean, it may sound pompous, but I think it's more important to be a writer first and a critic second. And I think, I mean, that's why when you ask me which critics I read, I tend to read the ones who are wonderful writers, because that means they have a point of view, they have something to express, and they have found their own style, they're getting at it. And I think if you major in film or become a film critic very early, I rather doubt that you're ever going to have that.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the people who have studied in the film schools, whether it's Scorsese, De Palma, Coppola, do you feel that the influence of watching many films of the past tends to be a more positive or a more negative thing? Or I don't even think that can be generalized about, but do you have a feeling about this?
It doesn't seem to matter to the enormously talented ones. Although I think there may be some limitation showing now with Scorsese. I don't think it showed as much early on, but I'm beginning to wonder, because his recent films have been exercises in style. And of course, the same thing has happened to Coppola. Now, Coppola has a very large background. I mean, I think he directed over 70 plays when he was at Hofstra, and he's directed opera. He's been involved in a great many things, and he has a very expansive, large personality. What has gone wrong with his movies at this point, I think, is also a kind of fixation on style. But a lot of crazy things have happened in the country, and I think we have to allow for the fact that our movie directors don't know what to make movies about, and so they fall back on old movies. If you were young and very talented, it might be very difficult to have anything to express in the film form now, because there has been considerable confusion in the country since Vietnam. The country has swung around in odd ways. There's a kind of general cynicism that's very strong among younger, talented people. I think it would be very difficult to know what to do. Too many young filmmakers have made movies about the problem of finding a subject to make a movie about, and that's an embarrassment. It's you know, when someone writes his first novel, it generally isn't about what am I going to write a novel about. There isn't a lot of experience behind the young filmmakers, but there doesn't seem to be a lot behind some of the older ones now either. And I think we often blame on the filmmakers what are really kind of terrible conditions in the country so far as the arts are concerned. I think the same thing has been true for novelists in the past few years. We haven't had novels that seem to express larger themes. And I think it's true in all the arts. In the visual arts, perhaps the least. But it's very tough, particularly for a young movie maker who gets the material in his hands, gets the technology, gets his family to put together $100,000 and makes his first film, and then it's about how he's a nice kid and wants to make out, or it's about how he wants to be a movie maker. It's pretty terrible to waste your relatives' money on that stuff. On the other hand, Stanley Kubrick's first movies were done that way, and they were pretty silly. And I'm afraid he was borrowing money from uncles and everybody else around. At least it gets you into the business, and maybe you'll grow up a little after a while. I think it was Bertolucci who said that a movie director is someone who can get hold of the money to make a movie. And that's just about what it is. And maybe the brains and the interests in the world have to follow. But I'm inclined to think that there was an advantage for people who broke into movies some time ago when they did a lot of other things in their lives before they became movie directors, that they brought something different to movies because of that. And we are getting a kind of wet behind the ears feeling in a lot of Hollywood movies.
Sure. Before I pose the next question, I'd like to remind you that you do have index cards, and feel free to fill them out, and then there will be an usher coming down, I believe, each of the center aisles to pick them up, and I believe one in the balcony as well, so that we can pose your questions too. I don't know if the ushers are here, but they will be momentarily. On this subject of the difficulty of breaking in, making movies, since you are indeed a woman, as well as being a film critic, I feel I'd like to ask you, do you have an idea, why is it that there are so few women filmmakers in Hollywood? Certainly, one can downgrade the French cinema, but at least women seem to be more visible, prolific there than here. Do you have any feelings about this?
Oh, I think it goes back into long theatrical traditions, and it has a lot to do with the kind of men who run the studios and their conception of a woman. And it goes back to really the idea that actresses are floozies and whores and available for the out-of-town salesman to sleep with. And it's very difficult for a woman to develop the respect to handle a crew. I think it's only in the last 5 years, really, that several young women have been making movies that are quite creditable, but they've had a hell of a time getting the experience. And I mean, we do now have Amy Jones and Amy Heckerling and a fair number of young women who haven't been heavily publicized who are doing quite good work. And I think there will be more and more, but the ones who preceded them had to break down all the union stereotypes. There are very few women in any of the guilds, so that a woman director, arrives on the set facing 150 to 200 tough union craftsmen who don't believe in her and think this is all a pile of crap. They have no confidence at all that a woman knows what she's doing with all these technical problems. And I think there are going to be more and more, and actually some very good women made films that somehow didn't have the subject matter. Joan Darling made quite an interesting film that didn't have the subject that appealed to the public. There have been some pretty good filmmakers among women in the last decade, and I think more of those will get a chance. Some of them are of course, getting training on television. But it is tough. I mean, 30 years ago, unless you were a star, you weren't treated with any respect if you were an actress. And, that's gradually changing.
It would seem, too, that it's when a woman's film doesn't work quite as well at the box office, it's almost a harsher response than if a man's film doesn't work. I know that there was a time a few years ago when it looked like you had Joan Micklin-Silver and Lee Grant and Joan Tewksbury and Claudia Wilde. There were suddenly seeming to be more women making features in Hollywood, and then all of a sudden we don't hear from them for a long time. They work in theater.
Well, I think some of the least talented got the most publicity. And there are a lot of ones now working who are quite talented, who are relatively unpublicized, and maybe it's just as well, because when you get all that coverage in the paper, there's too much weight on your shoulders. You're supposed to establish woman's right to direct. And maybe if you just sneak in and make your movie, it's a little bit better, although maybe all that publicity helped them in the background, I don't know. But I think it was a terrible burden to some of the women who fell under that juggernaut.
Okay, now to switch this a little bit more, I wanted to know too, what is your sense of the reader or readers that you write for? Who is the ideal or projected reader? Is it someone who's very much like you? Are you writing primarily to tell them whether to see or not see a film, or is it by now a question that you've established a readership that you feel more intimate with?
I think it's anybody who reads me. And it's an enormously varied group. People have very false ideas of the readers of The New Yorker. I get letters from kids in small southern towns who are in school, and I get a lot of letters from analysts, a lot from architects, a lot from the people you would think, but also a surprising number from people who are obviously very poor, but have taste and care about The New Yorker and care about criticism. And often they're people who tell me that they started reading me when they happened to pick me up one day, and I said something that coordinated with what they felt and hadn't been able to tell other people or make clear to other people. Say everybody in the town was wild about Gandhi, and they hated it. And you know, you make contact that way. People tell you that you help restore their sense of balance and their sanity sometimes. It's important to know that, you know, Winesburg, Ohio lives. And there are a lot of people in small towns who, you know, look at the local paper where they get a description of the beautiful photography and of the plot and are told that anything that has a respectable theme is a wonderful movie. And they develop taste, they have a feeling for it, and they want to make contact with somebody else who's writing, who validates their ideas. And I think that's an important reason for reading somebody. But I would love it if I had confidence that the readers of The New Yorker who read the movie column, say, I'm sure that's a minority of the readers, but that they would give a movie a shot if you know, I was very excited about it. But I'm sure that they don't. A lot of people like to read movie reviews because it helps them feel they know what's going on, but that doesn't mean they'll go out to see The Night of the Shooting Stars or Three Brothers or Under Fire. They tend, when they go out to the most heavily publicized movie around. And it's very disappointing that they will read you, but then they'll go out to the movies that you caution them against. And I don't think anything can be done about that. That's simply the power of publicity. It's the power of advertising. People are always complaining about the power of the critics, and of course it's the power of the advertisers that are really killing the art of movies.
And when you decide to write a review on a given film, first of all, do you have the right of final cut, to use a film term? In other words, can anyone edit you afterwards?
No.
And do you, it's all you?
No. Yes.
And do you ever feel some kind of either explicit or implicit pressure to write about certain films because they're in fact big blockbusters? For example, even if you had felt lukewarmly about, say, Gandhi as opposed to adamant, would you have felt that you had to cover it simply because it was a big film?
No, but if a certain film gets enough public acclaim, I do, and I don't agree that it is a good movie, I feel, yes, I should say something about it. For the most part. I mean, I make exceptions on Fassbinder and a few other people that I have a hard time staying awake for. But in general, if I can make it through a movie, and I think it's a stinker and it's getting a lot of attention, yes, I do write about it. Because I think a film that a lot of people are going to see is worth talking about. But what I'm most interested in writing about are the films that do something new, and the films that open a subject. I mean, the most exciting reviews to write, the ones that really give you a feeling of joy, are the ones that spur you to say something you've never thought of before, to get into a whole area of experience you've never got into before. And so a movie like, I enjoyed writing about Getting Out Your Handkerchief, because it dealt with male-female relations in a way that no other film I'd seen had. And I felt I was saying things that I'd never even thought of before, that I was going further as a writer. And that's what keeps you from turning into a hack. Because you want to be able to have new experiences as a writer. And each year there are at least half a dozen films that I think do give you that chance. But most of the other films don't. And a lot of it is like, you know, if you write about a big stinker, it's kind of public sanitation. It's not really, you know, you can't do much in the way of criticism on it. I mean, you can say a few silly, funny things maybe, and that relieves your feelings. But there isn't much that it can do for you as a person. The only films that can really do something for you as a person and as a writer are the ones that open you out to new experiences.
In fact, I sometimes get the feeling that there's this zesty and merciless humor that you've perfected. I mean, I'd like to give one example of one of my favorites. It seems almost like it's a compensation, a compensatory pleasure for an awful experience watching a film. It seems like stars get the brunt of your wrath very often, like about Robert Redford. You once wrote that he's turned almost alarmingly blonde. He's gone past platinum, he must be into plutonium. His hair is coordinated with his teeth. Now, that kind of thing raises the question of whether, again, like public sanitation, do you feel that it's indeed the stars, in other words, those who get the most advertising, the most publicity, the most visibility, who should in fact be most demystified by critics?
Well, Robert Redford is a man who's working generally beneath his capacities. And so he's fair game. I mean, because he's a wonderful actor who often does not do his best work in movies, who picks projects that are too easy, who picks safe projects often. You know, you don't see Robert Redford playing roles where he's a son of a bitch. He's the Mr. Nice Guy role. And you do respect an actor who's willing to try new things. I mean, Robert Redford controls his pictures. He's enormously powerful. He is one of the few people in the system who really can do just about anything he wants. And so it would make such a difference if he really tried something. And he gets such slavish attention for such mediocre work often. That yes, I'm more likely to jump on him than I would on a director, say, like Gene Hackman, who will try almost anything and does, you know, very daring work, often in films that nobody goes to see.
In fact, he's got a few coming out now, Misunderstood, and, well, Uncommon Valor just came out, and there's yet another one.
Uncommon Valor is a surprisingly good movie. It just happens to be a right-wing movie. And it's very unusual to have a good right-wing movie, and I think people don't know quite what to make of it. But it's worth seeing. It's a movie that you know takes you emotionally in the first few scenes and doesn't let you go till the very end. It's not a great movie by any means, but considering what a year it's been, that was probably one of the half dozen or so, one of the dozen or so best movies.
And also one person that I should return to, because every week I think the critic on stage has defined his position vis-a-vis Yentel, either pro-Streisand or against Streisand. And since you were actually, one of the first people to take Streisand quite seriously as an actress, as a performer, and did to a great extent support her earliest films, I just wanted to give a chance to add to the 4-week dialogue if you want to say anything about Yentel.
I think she's an enormously gifted woman who has been much maligned. Some of it may be her own fault. I can't speak to that. But she did something really daring in this movie. And, for a 40-year-old woman in her position, who is attacked that much to go out and direct a movie. And she directs it beautifully. She gets marvelous performances out of the people. And it's not an easy subject to deal with. It's a movie that I think probably has to do well in this country in order to make its money back, because I don't think there's much market for it in Europe or Asia. And I've been rather thunderstruck at how cavalierly a number of people have dismissed it, because I truly thought she did some exquisite work as an actress and as a director in it, and particularly in the middle of the movie. I think the beginning is rather weak and lacks confidence, and the end it's too much as if, you know, she were a star imprinted with moments of triumph from the past, and so she has reproduced something from Funny Girl. But the middle of that movie is first rate, and it would be a pity if she didn't go on directing, because so far I don't know of any women directors who have really showed more talent. That didn't surprise me, because a number of directors that she'd worked with had told me that she spent all her time on the set when she wasn't performing asking them very, very technical questions and asking them why they were doing what they were doing, and that she remembered everything they told her. Several directors have told me that she's the most inspiring and intelligent performer they've ever worked with. That is not what comes out in the press. And she simply started getting a bad press and has gotten it repeatedly. And she's often treated as if she were a very vulgar woman. That has not been my experience with her in a very limited way. She has, for example, phoned me a couple of times when I've given her very bad reviews to tell me that she understood why. And that is extraordinarily unexpected and rare from a star. And she is a woman who I think maybe can do just about anything that she really concentrates on. And I hope she'll be able to go on directing.
Okay, one question here. Have you ever criticized a film and then changed your mind for one reason or another? If so, why? And can you please give an example?
Oh, God, I'm not going to get points for humility tonight. I don't go back, so there isn't much way I can change my mind. I've changed my mind about, or simply remembered something. For example, when I reviewed The Big Chill, I didn't say very much about Mary Kay Place, and it wasn't until after I had gone to press on that review that her face and what she had done stayed in my mind, and I realized that she was awfully good in it. And I regretted not having, thought of that while I was writing about the picture. There are a lot of afterthoughts, and sometimes the mail brings letters from people that say, why didn't you mention so-and-so about a particular movie? Well, the reason was I didn't think of it. If I had, I would have done so. Very often a movie can be interpreted in so many ways that really marvelous interpretations come up in the mail, and I didn't think fast enough, that's all. I mean, you are limited by time and by, how well you're coordinating at the moment. Sometimes you've seen 30 or 40 movies, particularly after a festival, and you're trying to recall the details of the performances, or you're writing about several movies and you don't give a given performer his or her due. But so far as changing my mind about a movie, no, once I've written about it, I see it once and write about it, and I've gone back simply in order to check quotations or details sometimes after the review's written, before it's locked in at the press. But I don't have time to go back, and I'm more interested in what's new anyway. I'm not really that interested in poring over old movies to see if I did them an injustice. Somebody else will write the balance if I did. There are enough other people writing about movies, so you really don't have to worry, I I don't think, except in terms of the individual people that maybe you were not generous enough to. That's about it.
Or actually, a variation on that is that literally, do you sometimes see a film that you praise a lot, and then on second or third viewing, it doesn't hold up for you?
I don't get the second or third viewing, you
never
see.
get
I do go on. I remember a movie very well from having written about it. For example, I've never seen Last Tango in Paris, except that one time at the New York Film Festival, and I wrote about it. I really am interested in seeing something else, and of course the act of writing tends to fix the movie in your memory, and I'm just not that I'm not that drawn to the past.
Okay. Somebody asked, you once said to Sidney Lumet that it was your job as a critic to tell filmmakers what to do. Have you found that you're able to defend this statement?
I really don't believe I ever said that. Very often, directors or stars that you have not been terribly kind to in print come up with statements from you that make you sound like a monster. And truly, I imagine that Sidney Lumet thinks I said that. But I don't believe that I did. And I have read in Playboy things that Robert Redford says that I said that I know I didn't say. No, this is a reaction by people who are hurt. And you must remember that, you know, they don't get much chance to answer a critic except by whipping up some line like that. No, I do not think it's my job to tell directors what they should be doing. I'm really not that goofy.
Okay. Then somebody asked about here. No, I've lost it. In your reviews, you often go into detail and give away most of the plot. Don't you feel that often spoils it for those who haven't yet seen the film?
I honestly don't give away most of the plot. I try to cover just those aspects that I need to in order to discuss the movie. I'm very scrupulous about not giving away what happens. I mean, a couple of times I've had to bring in details. For example, I did bring in a detail on Don't Look Back, but I didn't give the denouement away. I mean, in this next week, I have a review of Splash, in which I do discuss some of the plot details, but I'm very careful not to give away the finish. I think that's one of those things that people always say, that critics give things away. I'm very careful not to give away the jokes either. I don't give away the punchlines. I don't really respect critics who make their columns look lively by telling the jokes from the movie. And no, I don't think I can accuse myself that much there.
Someone says, I'm interested to know why you've never written about the recently revived Hitchcock films, Vertigo, Rear Window, etc., and would like to hear you comment on them.
Oh, I kept thinking if there's a slow week and nothing new of interest, I'll write about them. I'm not terribly interested in them, and so many people have written so much about them. Why do people want to read one more article on Rear Window or Dial M for Murder or God, well, The Man Who Knew Too Much is just an atrocity. And The Trouble with Harry, I think, is a very boring movie. I had a hard time sitting through it in the 50s. Now, I mean, these Vertigo, I am not really very drawn to. I saw it the day it opened in San Francisco, and I remember my disappointment. Now, I know a great many people are quite fixated on that movie, and have a very, close personal relation to it. And I understand that. I understand what they see in it, but I don't really feel that way about it. And so it would just be very harsh and argumentative. I don't want to argue with people who enjoy a movie. I'd much rather write about something, that's happening that's new.
That leads to this question. How do you feel about the independent American film movement?
Well, it all depends on the film. Some of them are wonderful, a lot of them aren't. And I don't think that the columnists who write about the independent film movement and who praise a lot of regional films and a lot of film really do it a service when they overpraise. I know it's probably the only way to get an audience, but a lot of the films I've seen have, not been that exciting. And sometimes they fall in the category of praiseworthy. And when I am excited about them, I write about them. When I don't write about a film that's getting a lot of attention, it's generally because I don't like it very much. For example, that film by the NYU student, the woman, the Susans.
Susan Seidelman.
Yes, the Susan Seidelman film, I thought was really not very good. And there's no point writing about a small independent film unless you can help it. There's no reason to hurt it. And that one was doing reasonably well, so I didn't want to step on, to rain on that parade. That's generally my reason. I mean, there are enough big targets without hitting little targets.
What American movies have died a quiet death that you felt should have had longer, more popular runs?
Well, there's the great example of Melvin and Howard. There's the great example of Citizens Band, both from Jonathan Demme. I thought those were both beauties as films, lovely films. And for one reason or another, nobody went to them. It gets very complicated. Often films just don't get the push initially because the company didn't believe in them. And then even though the company talks about giving them another chance and getting behind them, they're really out to prove they were right the first time, that there was no audience for it. But I think it has to be said that people trained on television do not probably very easily respond to films that have a certain amount of subtlety, that don't have a driving plot that, that they can cue into right away, movies that don't tell them how to respond. That's one thing about Chariots of Fire, that music told you how to respond. And I think increasingly people are dependent on those signals. But, there are a lot of good movies, but those just happen to come to mind.
Do you feel constrained about writing on films by directors, writers, and actors whom you know?
I don't really. I read about how I pal around with people, but I live in the Berkshires. I'm a long way from either the New York scene. I don't do interviews, so I never meet them, unless they call me after the review is out and want to talk it over. And that's generally how I've met most of the directors or actors I've met. And sometimes it's very rough because they're very hurt. But I really don't do much palling around. I'm much more likely to be home writing or working or playing with my grandson than I am to be, palling around. I don't go on junkets. I never go to press parties. It's not because I'm depriving myself. I'm extremely gregarious, but I'd rather be gregarious with old friends. Rather than, going to movie parties.
What would you identify as the foundations or marks of an American style in movies? Are there things that tie the films of people like Spielberg and Scorsese together?
I think their films are very different. Spielberg is more of an American traditional because he really works pretty much the way the studio directors used to, but I think with a much more brilliant technique. And of course, he started very young. And he does have a sweetness that is his most personal mark. I mean, that's what joins E.T. To some of the aspects of Sugarland Express and some of his and Close Encounters, of course. He also has what I think is a very mercenary and mechanical side, which comes out in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is, professional, hard-driving, totally impersonal movie making, and which I have no great feeling for. And I regret that he's doing another one in that series. Because I think it's time for him to start developing more of an interest in his subjects, if he's ever going to. He's in his 30s now. It's time for him to grow up. Indiana Jones is, of course, what the studios want, and I'm afraid it's what the public wants. But it would be fun to see him do some things that maybe meant more to him. Now, I gather he's producing or possibly also directing Schindler's List. I hope he doesn't, take it as incumbent on him to produce a serious, solemn, wretched, praiseworthy movie. That is possible. It would be great if he could keep that marvelous technique and start applying it to something.
Would you agree with the statement that you are or tend to be tough on female actresses?
I don't think that's true. I think people have this cliche about, they think that a woman critic must be hard on actresses. I think if you actually examined my reviews, you'd find probably there's more celebration of the talent of the people I think are good. I think that may be because I have not been terribly impressed by Meryl Streep. On the other hand, I have been deeply impressed by a lot of other people. And I do think Meryl Streep is a very, very talented actress. I just don't think she has ever mastered the sort of basics of film, of giving yourself to the camera instead of always acting in front of it. I feel she's controlled in front of that camera all the time. And because of that control, she might be better as a comedy actress than in the kinds of roles she has chosen. And also because she is in terrible danger of turning into the next Greer Garson if she doesn't knock it off. She's just becoming the suffering, goddessy woman too much. And that's a very dangerous thing for a star to do. I'm not sure that stars recover from that. For one thing, they're going to wear the audience out.
I remember actually in your review of Sophie's Choice, you said something like that the strange thing about Meryl Streep is you can never remember her from the neck down. And
well, that's an important element in an actress. And I think she tried to go to the other extreme in Silkwood, but you still don't really remember her from the neck down. And the control is really, it's all from the outside in, and it's a very tight control. That does not mean that she's not a serious, dedicated actress. But I think the greatness of certain movie actresses, such as Barbara Stanwyck, was their instinctive understanding that they gave themselves to the camera and did as little as possible. And certain people have simply had that right from the beginnings of their career, and others have learned it as they've gone on. She has not yet learned it, I don't think.
Howard Hawks used to call that a girl that the camera likes. He was using the term about Lauren Bacall, but it was the idea that a camera likes somebody like
Well, I think that's slightly different. I think the camera liked her in that Howard Hawks period because she was so terrific looking. She was really a lousy actress, and which showed in the pictures she made apart from Hawks. And I'm not convinced she's ever been a very good actress. But I do think that simply because she was stunning looking. She looked like a great blonde cat. And there is that aspect of movies. I mean, the camera loves Jacqueline Bisset, who isn't much of an actress, but who at least doesn't do too much and who is, tender and passionate and fun to watch. I'm not sure the camera really loves Rachel Ward, although it seemed to in her first couple of movies. But having seen her in Against All Odds, I'm not sure, good looks are going to carry her, because she's more like a model in this than she was in her first movie. And the people coming out of the theater were saying things like, she's not as beautiful as I thought she was. And I think that's because she's just such an uninteresting actress, and she doesn't really give herself to the camera, but the camera can't really feast on her after a while.
I agree with you. The only thing is, after seeing Against All Odds, I wonder how meaty a part that was for any actress. In other words, these days, some of these remakes are not exactly giving actresses much to do.
Well, but you look at Swoosie Kurtz, who has about a 3-minute role and who absolutely grabs you and involves you, and you care about her and everything she does, but she is an actress.
Yeah,
and that does make a difference. And she does know what she's doing on camera. She knows not to do too much. And she isn't afraid of being a little nutty, which helps a lot for an actress. I think more actors and actresses are destroyed by solemnity than anything else.
Someone asks, do you ever read Andrew Sarris anymore?
Well, it's hard. I think, by the way, he is often a marvelous critic. And several times a year, I think he writes a terrific review and really says what needs to be said about a given movie. But I do think he turned into an old curmudgeon awfully early. And curmudgeonly writing can become very tedious.
Are there any novels that you would like to see as a film, and who should direct it?
Oh, that's always, I think generally speaking, that's a very sad thing to talk about, because it's never the person you thought should do it who does it. And it's never the people you thought should be in it who are in it. I think John Candy should star in Confederacy of Dunces, but I know he wants to, but I doubt if anybody will finance the movie. I mean, there are those matings made in heaven, but in general, you know, people are highly adaptable, and when the scripts are written, they're shaped for the talents of particular stars. So it's a pretty sad business. I remember when I was at Berkeley as an undergraduate, we used to sit around, you know, dreaming who should do Return of the Native. Well, nobody did Return of the Native. And maybe we're better off for it. So, I mean, maybe the works are safer because nobody did them. Every time I've seen Masterpiece Theater do a novel I really loved, I've died. I watch 10 minutes and scream and shriek at the set. And I can't watch them when they do books I care about. And so maybe it's better if they do books you don't care about and make something of them.
Somebody writes, Dear Miss Kael, you are the best. But is it possible to fall too deeply in love with one director's work, such as Peckinpah or De Palma, and begin to overrate them? You held out hope for Peckinpah long after everyone else had abandoned ship. Please comment.
Well, I don't think you should abandon ship on Peckinpah. I thought his last movie had a terrible script which was imposed on him, but I thought he did stunning work in it. And I've never given him those great reviews that I'm accused of giving him. I was very rough on Straw Dogs, although I do think it's the work of an artist. I think he's a major director, a man of just enormous talent, and probably he'll never get a chance to really work out his talent. I mean, most of the things he's wanted to do, he's not been able to get financed, and he's gotten labeled as a certain kind of director. But if you remember the Noon Wine he did on television, there were touches in that went far beyond what anybody was doing on television and what anybody's doing in television now. And there are moments of such brilliance in The Wild Bunch and in Straw Dogs and in some of his movies, even in, terrible movies like The Killer Elite, that I think you have to recognize the talent of the man and hope that more of it will show. A lot of these directors aren't very old. And sometimes they seem old because of the way they live and what they've been through and the beating they take trying to do something. But, men like Altman and Peckinpah are in their 50s. They're not old men, and you can't write them off too soon.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about the critic as celebrity or media figure, whether it's Siskel, Ebert, or yourself?
Well, You know, as I say, I live in the Berkshires. I'm fairly private. I did get spread all over a magazine this past year, but that was not by my choice. I couldn't control it. I couldn't stop it. Very often, people get the impression that you're much more in the public eye than you are. I'm really not all out there that much. I can't speak for Siskel and Ebert except to say I don't think what they do on television is much in the way of criticism. And that's all I care. What they do as media figures, I don't care about. What I'm interested in is whether you do a good job as a critic or not. And no, I don't think they do. But then I didn't, maybe they wouldn't if they weren't on television. So who can say? I mean, character has a lot to do with the way critics operate. I think character may be as important as intelligence and taste. And a lot of people are very easily seduced. And they can be non-media figures and writing on obscure periodicals and be just as lousy as some of the people who stand up on TV. So what can we say, except that it's a pity that movie criticism on television is generally left to failed actors and to people who have nice cow eyes and to people who have really no perceptions about movies at all, because they do hurt the good movies. In praising the big clinkers, they take attention away from the interesting movies. People don't hear about the interesting movies. And in that sense, they do a real disservice, I think, to the future of the art form.
Would you please pick the major Oscar winners? Why? And if you won't answer, why not?
I will answer that I think my opinion of the movies is very different from selecting the winners. And I could probably do a pretty fair job of picking the winners, but that has nothing to do with my function as a critic. I've written about the movies that I think are good, and you can take it from there.
Do you feel that films have to be art, or can't one just enjoy something because it's escapist or fantasy or just entertains?
Well, of course you can, but I think that all art is also entertainment, depending on how educated and perceptive you are. I can't conceive of art that would not be entertainment, even though I do know a lot of works get praised as art, which are certainly not entertaining. But not all entertainment is art. And anything that gives us pleasure is something to applaud and to be happy about. I mean, there's no point being a Puritan about movies. That's partly the trouble often with the educated audience. They do want only works that are good for them. And that's why I think, say, the Sunday Arts and Leisure section often does so much harm, because it does exalt those works which are good for you, whether they're good or not. And very often the writers, such as you, don't really express your opinion of the work you're writing about. I mean, I assume that often you know how dull those pictures are. But that celebrity which is imposed on certain dull, often European works, does do harm to the other works that we don't hear about, that's all.
Yeah. As far as the Arts and Leisure section is concerned, just as a point of information, they never allow freelance writers, in other words, people who are not on staff, to expressly put an opinion into the article on the given film, because they view those writers primarily as reporters or journalists who are doing an interview. And I have on many occasions had my adjectives and adverbs taken out.
I think it's a great pity. It would be better if it were more of an open forum, since we've already had the daily reviews which express the official opinion. And it would be, it would be better if we had a little bit more freedom on Sunday.
I agree. Incidentally, This point is well taken because Under Fire, a film that was mentioned earlier, I mean, just to, I don't want to tell tales out of school, but I tried very hard to place my interview with Roger Spotswood in the New York Times on Sunday because I thought it was a film that should be seen. And because the line on the Times line was not going to be favorable enough, and because it was considered more a political film and therefore should be covered by a political correspondent, and my take would have been too positive, it ended up in Cineast magazine. It's that kind of thing that happens very often.
Well, it's really tragic because the Times is so important to movies and to moviegoers, and a little more of an open forum would make an enormous difference.
I agree. Finally, about 3 or 4 people asked the same question, a variation of this. In I Lost It at the Movies, you had a Movies Remembered with Pleasure section. Please add some more titles of works that gave you pleasure. And the related question is, what do you think are the greatest films ever made?
Oh, well, the first one, I try in the front of the New Yorker, every time a movie comes up that I haven't written about before, that I think you should know about. For example, last week I wrote about The Sundowners, the Fred Zinnemann film, because it was being revived, and I thought that was a chance, to try to persuade people to go see it. It didn't do well on its first time around. I think it's a marvelous movie. When something does come up, I try to use the front of the magazine for that purpose, rather than taking space away from the new movies. But any kind of revival of something I really deeply care about, I try to alert people to in the front of the paper. What do I think are the greatest movies of all time? There are so many. That's the wonderful thing about movies. There are so many different kinds of great movies. And there are marvelous comedies. I love musicals. One of my favorite movies of recent years was Pennies from Heaven, which practically nobody went to see. And that was one that desperately needed the press and didn't get it. I mean, our only chance of having more MGM musicals, it was the first MGM musical in a couple of decades. And because it was very sophisticated and took a rather complex point of view, I think the press failed it, and the picture it didn't even open in a lot of European countries because the company lost faith in it. And so you get the same director doing Footloose. It's heartbreaking that the man who made Pennies from Heaven then makes Footloose, because Pennies from Heaven does have a real feeling for what a musical can be. But for example, I'd rather talk about movies that I think are marvelous that nobody went to see rather than the standard great ones. I thought that Brian De Palma's Blowout was an absolutely stunning political thriller. And there again, it didn't get a press, and it disappeared, even though it had by far, I think, John Travolta's finest performance. And its only chance really came at the end of the year, when it should have at least have had some nominations, and of course it didn't get them. Those are the sad things about being a critic, because Brian De Palma gets jumped on all the time by people who don't even go see his movies and don't know what he's doing. Or he brings out something like Scarface and it gets praised. There again, it's a case of the press being wrong all the time. But anyway, I wish people, when there are revivals of movies they missed, would maybe take a look at the front of the New Yorker and maybe make a selection. I try, of course, on old movies. I'm happy to see that Midnight has developed a following, and I hope I contributed to that part way by the note in the front of the magazine. That's sort of the only way I have for doing tribute to movies of the past. I don't want to try to turn my column into a reminiscences or into going back. I really want to use that for what's live and new, particularly now because I can't write every week. I simply don't have the physical strength to do it. And so I do it only every other week. And so I want to use that space for what I think needs to be said now.
Mm-hmm. And finally, we've sort of gone through a couple of the real problems that exist with contemporary American films. Is there something that one can be optimistic about in the coming year? Anything that you can give us to look forward to, or anything that you feel hopeful about in general?
It's so terrible. There are hardly any movies to look forward to this year, except for David Lynch's Dune. There's practically nothing. And And I don't know of any year in which at the beginning you look forward to the whole year and it seems like a vacancy. And it's been pretty terrible the last few years. And David Lynch is, of course, a marvelously gifted man, the man who made Eraserhead and The Elephant Man. But I don't know what the devil can be done with Dune. All you can do is hope. But the directors that you might expect something great from, the Coppolas, the Scorseses, the other, I mean, they're not, I mean, you know, Scorsese wants to make a Christ movie. Well, that means 5 years at least. Coppola's Cotton Club, all you can do is hope, without maybe too much confidence. I mean, you know, I haven't even written about the last couple of Coppola movies because once you've panned one and you see two more exercises in style, it's not much fun panning somebody again and again. It seems to violate the Marquis of Queensberry rules. You don't, it's not fun at all jumping on somebody's face. It really isn't. And so I'm eager for them to do something good, but I just don't know. What's hopeful is the incredible talent among the students of the country and the number of very, very bright people who want to make movies. I mean, they are equivalent to the people who, say, 30 years ago wanted to write poetry or wanted to become architects or painters. I think those same people now want to make movies. And a lot of them are talented in strange and amazing ways. I do see films now and then that knock me silly, that are made at art museums or by people who are teaching at colleges. They're short films. And you think, oh, if only this person wanted to work with actors and could bring this kind of sensibility into a larger arena. They very, very rarely do. They get hooked on foundation grants and universities, and they tend to make the same movie over and over again. But some of these people are bound to break out. I mean, you know, movie making didn't stop with Spielberg or Scorsese. There have got to be new generations, and they're going to draw on the talents of Europeans such as Chris Marker. I mean, Chris Marker in The Jetty did things with science fiction that nobody else has ever got into. I think students who see a lot of movies are going to be drawn to try to follow them, do something new. I think the only place you can see hope is in that kind of obstreperous, talented kid who's all over the country and who's now male and female, and they're going to bring something new into movies, but they're going to be bucking a system. They have to be very, very tough to do it. Jean Renoir once said that Cocteau could have made many more movies if only he had known how to deal with the money men, that he could never bring himself to master that. I think Americans tend to be tougher about that. And maybe the kids who are smart enough to get themselves to USC or UCLA or the Film Institute out there and use it simply as a way to make contacts do learn about how to be tough. I don't think they learn much about making movies, but I think they learn a lot about how the system works. And probably that's what they need most of all.
Well, as a teacher, I thank you for that. And as moderator, I thank you for the privilege of sharing the stage with you, and I thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.